பீரண்டை ரசத்தோடு சமதமாகின்ற ஜீரக மிளகுடன் உப்பரத்தியாகும் அவ்வப்போடுள்ள நல்வாசனையாங் பெருங்காயமும் சேர்த்து சத்சங்கமாகும் பீரண்டை ரசத்தோடு சமதமாகின்ற ஜீரக மிளகுடன் உப்பரத்தியாகும் அவ்வப்போடுள்ள நல்வாசனையாங் பெருங்காயமும் சேர்த்து அப்பளம் ஏட்டு பாரு அதை சாப்பிட்டுன் ஆசையே தீரு அப்பளம் ஏட்டு பாரு கல் நெஞ்சில் நான் நான் என்று கலங்காமல் கல் நெஞ்சில் நான் நான் என்று கலங்காமல் உள்முக உலக்கையால் ஓயாதிடித்து கல் நெஞ்சில் நான் நான் என்று கலங்காமல் உள்முக உலக்கையால் ஓயாதிடித்து சாந்தமாங்குழவியால் சமமான பலகையில் சந்ததம் சலிப்பர சந்தோஷமாகவே அப்பளம் ஏட்டு பாரு சாந்தமாங்குழவியால் சமமான பலகையில் சந்ததம் சலிப்பர சந்தோஷமாகவே அப்பளம் ஏட்டு பாரு அதை சாப்பிட்டுன் ஆசையே தீரு அப்பளம் ஏட்டு பாரு.
Thank you so much for your kind attention. I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, welcome to this webinar on the very topic, Surrendering to Self, Ramana Maharshi's message for the present. It is a movement of extreme pleasure to welcome the guests who are virtually present here to attend this webinar. I welcome Honorable Speaker, Professor Patrick Laude from Georgetown University Qatar. I welcome Moderator of today's session, Professor Kumar Giri from Madras Institute of Development Studies, Chennai, and Honorary Trustee of Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our Chief Patron, Honorable Dr. Justice Meena Vigomber, former Chief Justice of Rajasthan High Court, Professor Divakar Goli, President of Raffles University, and all the respected participant, viewers, listeners, both on Facebook platform and Zoom platform. Let me give a kind of brief introduction to our Honorable Speaker. Patrick Laude, Dr. Patrick Laude was born in France in 1958. He took a graduate degree in philosophy at University of Paris, Sorbonne, while studying at the very famous institution, the École Normale Supreme in Paris. He came to the US in the early 80s and obtained his PhD in 1985 from Indiana University. He joined Georgetown University in 1991. He is currently professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar, where he has been teaching since 2006. Professor Laude's scholarly work is primarily focused on comparative mysticism, the symbolic imagination in religion and literature, and Western interpretations of Islam and Eastern traditions. He is author of several books and numerous articles in these days. He is author of the new book, The Surrendering of Self, Ramana Maharshi's message for the present, which just published from her publication in 2021. Welcome you, sir. and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Let me give a brief introduction to our Swadhyay Chakra, that is a co-learning circle of self and mutual studies. Uh, Swadhyay Chakra is an initiative of studying and learning together self, culture, societies, and the world. Our friends associated with this are eager to walk and navigate with new horizons of thinking and new movements of social and cultural change at work in our contemporary world. We study seekers such as Sri Aurobindo, Mahatma Gandhi, Chitranjan Das, a seeker and creative thinker from Orissa, and many others from around the world. We also present our own writing and reflect our own creativity together. We also invite seekers from different fields of life to share with us their lives, vision, sadhana, and struggles for creating a world of beauty, dignity, and dialogue. We meet every Sunday or sometimes on Wednesday. We are nurturing this talk in collaboration with Department of Humanities and Social Science of Raffles University. Today is a very special day. We got messages from different part of the world, and there are so many followers from Ramana Maharshi. They are joining from our Facebook platform. And Ramana Maharshi, the renounced Indian sage, was one of the most significant spiritual teachers who emerged from India during the first half of the century and remains widely admired. He has often been described as the very incarnation of non-dualism and Advaita. Uh, he is beloved by many seekers who came to him for guidance, answering the questions sought on the road, enlightenment. His teaching, which transcend all religious differences. His teaching helped people to from diverse background and tradition to the source of enduring peace and happiness, that is self-realization, self-enlightenment. Uh, Today's webinar is going to help us to discover the essence of Sri Rama's teaching so that we can understand the world in a better way and understand the self in a real way. So, with this brief introduction and observation, I would like to invite Professor Anant Kumar Giri sir to kindly moderate today's session.
Thank you so much, dear Randhir, and a warm welcome to Professor Patrick Laude and all friends co-presents. This is such an important day in our journey of life. This happens to be our last Sunday in this blissful year of 2021, many of its challenges, and how enriching that we are provisionally concluding this calendar year with the co-presence of our dear and respected Professor Patrick Laude, who is not only an academic scholar, but he also is an inspiring seeker. And this book is a confluence of that. And only when philosophy becomes a way of meeting of quest and deep, rigorous, scholastic inquiry, it becomes a companion in enrichment of life. So it is in that spirit, Patrick's book with Ramana Maharshi and Ramana Maharshi's journey with self. The book is so invitingly titled as Surrendering to the Self. And this is a very profound journey. And I myself being on the journey. And I'm greeting you, all of you, from this place called the East Hostel of Ravenshaw College. And now it is Ravenshaw University. So I'm just sitting in one room in Ravenshaw University, and I just want to show you this. This is a journal of our hostel, which I edited in 1983-84. And our hostel was celebrating its 100 years on 24th of December. And it is a very beautiful garden and sitting in this place. And we are meditating with the deep theme that Patrick is exploring in this book. Very briefly, I want to submit that some of the deep thoughts that Patrick is cultivating in this book, when he's exploring Ramana Maharshi, or when he's walking and meditating with Ramana Maharshi. And Ramana Maharshi's main focus is on self-realization or self-inquiry. And Patrick is inviting us to understand that when we talk of self-inquiry or self-realization, there is a possibility that we would always look at it through the prism of individualism. And this is something very important to remember. And coming from France, and Patrick and is bringing the name of Louis Dumont, and
Yes.
who wrote profound treatise on India, Homo Hierarchicus. And Dumont's point is that Indian civilization is not modeled on the primacy of the individual. And he says that how modern West is built on individualism. He has a book called Essays on Individualism. But when we come to self, when we come to the soul dimension, and with Ramana Maharshi's quest, what building on Professor Arvind Sharma, another great seeker of Indic thought, who represents Ramana Maharshi's work as absolutistic, but very deeply the way Patrick works and meditates with Ramana Maharshi, it opens up many bridges of conversation. For example, Patrick is saying that though Ramana Maharshi and as Ramana Maharshi, let us put it that way, was deeply in quest of the one, the absolute, but he, Patrick writes, to quote him, he was keenly aware of the diversity of needs and paths leading to it. Therefore, that diversity of needs and paths, and Patrick makes this profound comment that with Ramana Maharshi, we find a different kind of pluralism. And that pluralism is multiplicity in the light of a single source and a single goal. And here, to understand the work of Ramana Maharshi, Patrick uses the term relativistic absolutism. And that is a very interesting way to think about it. And this way of reading Ramana Maharshi and self-realization also opens up many bridges of communication. For example, the path of self-realization and spiritual quest and social science understanding of diversity, relativism, and the absolute. It is in that spirit when I was reading this term, relativistic absolutism, from Patrick's books very quickly, because I have been on the road for the last 10 days or so, and my son sits in the, and my son rises, our son rises, on the road. So what I thought is that we can also bring notion of relational absolutism. This relativistic absolutism is in fact a relational absolutism. It is in this context, Patrick also makes very profound invitation. He's saying that to understand the sadhana of Ramana Maharshi, it is not helpful just to go with the dualism between religion and spirituality. And rather what Patrick is saying that Ramana Maharshi is pointing to a different possibility of the religious. And because sometimes it is very easy to make a distinction between religion and spirituality, and then to put spirituality at a superior pedestal. But some scholars, including Professor Robert Bellah, who is a great scholar of religion, and I had a chance to meet with him at Berkeley in 2003. And Professor Robert Bellah's challenge is also that let us not, while making a distinction between religion and spirituality, let us not be so confident, because the need for community, a practice, is also very important. Then regarding the title, Surrendering to the Self, I was thinking that when we surrender, the notion of surrender, it easily brings up this image of we raising of our hands up. But surrender also could mean that we are surrounding ourselves. We are putting our hands around. And so my submission is like we are bringing surrounding ourselves with our prayerful hands, which is rising up and rising around with a sense of seeking, a sense of protection, as well as a sense of evolutionary transportation. So therefore, surrender brings the vertical and the horizontal and the vertical together. And here that Patrick's thought that surrendering involves both grace and devotion. And therefore, our own path also is nurtured by grace. So with some of these initial thoughts, so it is a joy for me to welcome Patrick, Professor Patrick Laude, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Randhir, Kumar, Gautam, and Professor Ananta, Giri, for your kind invitation. I'm very humble, very pleased, but also very humble to be among you and to speak about one of the greatest luminaries of our times, on the contemporary period. I have been asked by Ananta to speak for about 45 minutes, which I will do. And then I hope we will have time to converse, to exchange through a question and answer session. So, although many books were written about Ramana Maharshi, he was definitely not himself an author out of vocation. His own works were actually composed in response to inquiries or requests from his devotees. And the paucity of Ramana's writings is no doubt one of the reasons why academic books on the Maharshi are relatively few. Indeed, in one of his rare scholarly studies, John Grimes quotes the Maharshi warning against the dangers of the mind when writing and reading become illusory substitutes for spiritual realization. I quote, "The more the mind expands, the farther it goes and renders self-realization more difficult and complicated," end of quote. To wit, the Maharshi actually compares to a gramophone those who do not seek beyond the mental script of the doctrine. But this does not mean, of course, that the mind cannot play a preparatory role in spiritual realization. Through knowledge by description, we may succeed in gaining knowledge by identity. And thus, Advaita Vedanta itself assigns specific functions to the reading of scriptures and to the meditation of the doctrine, as also to the pondering concentration of the mind on the ultimate object of knowledge, which is referred to as nididhyasana. By contrast with holistic perspectives, such as traditional Advaita, the Maharshi's teachings do not arise, however, from an explicitly religious outlook. Thus, the seemingly a-religious starting point of the Maharshi's self-realization may be free from associations that would hinder its radiance in a secular context, and therefore perhaps resonate beyond its civilizational and spiritual land of India. On the other hand, it is by virtue of being situated at the intersection of the universe of Hinduism and of the axis of universal inner emancipation that the Maharshi's perspective may provide one with a renewed sense of religion that redefines its meaning and end in terms of self-knowledge. Moreover, I would like to suggest that in an age in which truth is split and presence elusive, the Maharshi vision opens the way to a different kind of pluralism. The Maharshi taught a kind of relativistic absolutism, as Ananta mentioned. Arvind Sharma has also characterized Ramana's Hinduism as absolutistic. On the spiritual plane, however, as Ananta already mentioned, this absolutism with respect to the goal of life led the Maharshi to recognize, in fact, the relativity of religious paths, a recognition that may strike a chord with the contemporary ethos of pluralism. In addition, the simplicity of the Maharshi's teachings, as epitomized by his recurring question, "Who am I?" may be considered as suitable to our times when viewed as a response to the growing complexities of contemporary life. The current call for simple formulae and tangible realization may make the Maharshi's direct question, "Who am I?" appealing to contemporary audiences, but I would suggest that it doesn't do so without a measure of ambiguity that must be attended to, and I will go back to this question a bit later. This holds true inasmuch as the intricate demands of the modern lifestyle, which is ever more bent on multiple stimuli and activities, make it increasingly arduous, if not perhaps impossible, to keep a single-minded focus on a sustained self-inquiry of the kind that the Maharshi advocates. The spiritual perspective of the Maharshi is most often introduced, at least in Western secondary literature, as a kind of psycho-spiritual technique centered on a consistent, if not constant, meditation on the inquiry, "Who am I?" And this investigative question was, in fact, the seed and the very core of his own spiritual experience, which was the key to his extraordinary breakthrough when he experienced in the house of his uncle in Madurai an intense fear of death that led him to seek for the true I, that which doesn't die. Ramana's enlightenment was not, therefore, the outcome of a formal path of a sadhana, which he would have followed under the guidance of a human guru within the traditional framework of the Hindu way. Indeed, Hinduism provides seekers, as you know, with countless spiritual paths adjusted to the diverse qualifications and needs of human beings. But Ramana did not tread any of those margas. He simply actualized through meditational inquiry a self-realization that had been latent in him and merely waited for a catalyst. And this catalyst was a sudden and most intense fear of death. In a sense, I would like to suggest that the Maharshi's breakthrough was akin to the Shivaite Anupaya, the pathless path that does not rely on any available spiritual traditional means or upaya, while being an immediate self-realization of the absolute. It is sometimes thought that in very, very rare cases, the most minimal or subtle spur may quicken self-realization without apparent spiritual antecedent. And such was the case indeed of the question, "Who am I?" in the Maharshi's Epiphany. While it is therefore undeniable that the Maharshi's overall perspective lies in the 3 words of his basic inquiry, to reduce the Maharshi's teaching to this shortcut may fail to do justice to the integral radiance of the sage and to the full spectrum of the spiritual resources that he made available to his devotees. More specifically, the fact that no explicitly God-centered perspective or formal practice played a role in the event, quote unquote, of self-realization must not lead one to draw the conclusion that the Maharshi's pathless path is in no way related to the fundamental categories of religious experience. Let me illustrate this point by the example of the question of grace. The notion of grace is sometimes considered to be foreign to the world of non-dualism, whether from a neo-Vedantic apologetic point of view or from a Christian polemical vantage point. Some would like us to believe that Hindu non-duality or non-dualism is a purely human and intellectual exercise that requires no sense of God and certainly no divine intervention. The corollary of this kind of views is that grace would be particularly or exclusively perhaps associated with theistic teachings, such as those of Christianity, for example, while being contrary to the tenets of any non-dual teaching centered on self-realization, such as those of Advaita Vedanta. Far from being centered on grace, the latter are therefore understood to be dependent upon individual initiatives, individual efforts, and individual practices. This is, however, a partial, perhaps superficial, and no doubt ultimately misleading view of what is at stake in the process of spiritual realization, according to the Maharshi and according also to the Advaitin tradition as a whole. It is a view that does not account, moreover, for the fullness of the Maharshi's teachings himself. It is worth stressing from the start that the individual self can never realize the Atman, since it is by definition, since the individual self is by definition a kind of veil or superimposition upon the self. The idea that the individual self would be the agent of self-realization is actually diametrically opposed to Advaita. Only the self, only the Paramatman can know and free itself. And this flows from the obvious observation that the finite can in no way realize the infinite as such. Or in other words, from the strict point of view of the jiva, of the individual soul, self-realization is literally unreachable. What is realized, what is liberated, is therefore not the personal self, even though the latter may and must draw benefits of this realization on its own level of reality and consciousness. At first sight, perhaps this observation may sound at odds with the Maharshi's fundamental question, who am I? Nevertheless, a close consideration of the actual process of inquiry recommended by the Maharshi demonstrates the crucial validity of this point. And in order to develop it, I would like to highlight that, as David Godman has highlighted, in the teachings of Ramana Maharshi, two levels that are often mistakenly conflated must be distinguished. What are these two levels? Well, the first is the human investigation into the I, the vichara itself, which results at a second stage only into its subsiding in the center of consciousness, that is the heart. Thus, the vichara or inquiry is, in its inception at least, an individual process of investigation. That is, that the mind looks for its source, which it cannot find without disappearing, for it cannot be both the subject and the object. But this, and I quote here Gautam, but this, according to Sri Ramana, is as much as the devotee can do by himself, end of quote. It is only when this freedom from thoughts and this freedom from misidentifications has been achieved that, I quote again Godman, the power of the self pulls the I thought back into the heart center and eventually destroys it so completely that it never rises again, end of quote. Now, the second of these moments is obviously akin to grace, inasmuch as it remains totally independent from human efforts or doings. And that shows quite clearly, or that illustrates quite clearly, that Atma Vichara, the self-investigation, is not a psychological exercise, and that it is, in this respect, radically different from the various forms of self-help spirituality that have inundated the market of the search for meaning in the last decades, particularly in the Western world. In other words, what it means is that self-inquiry entails transcendence, since the divine power that draws the eye toward its source belongs to an incommensurable order of reality. This is important, this is crucial, I think, because any bypassing or any belittling of this transcendent reality falls short of the real meaning of spirituality in the Maharshi's perspective. Thus, the sage underlines that the striving of the mind is in itself powerless if divine grace does not exercise its pull upon it. I quote here from the Maharshi himself: if God, who is in the mind, does not draw the mind inwards by the might of his grace, who can attain peace by diving into the heart by the mere power of his own mind, which is treacherous? End of quote. This is therefore what could be called the divine moment, which is clearly identifiable with knowledge, because only the Atman can know the Atman in pure self-knowledge. For a self known by other than the self would not be the real self. In the Advaitin tradition, the only knowledge ultimately worth this name is knowledge through identification. It is the knowledge Atman has of itself. And this is, from a human point of view, pure grace, grace of the self. Although the spiritual practice is deemed to be preparatory and in a way necessary for self-realization, the latter cannot be explained in terms of the former. And this is because the two are indeed incommensurable. To put the matter in a nutshell, it could be said that there is no grace but through and by the self, and more fundamentally, that the self is grace. Such an expression may present some difficulty perhaps to those who have been conditioned to think of grace as something supernatural and as it were external to the human self, since it comes or seems to come from above. But the grace that is at stake here is not to be equated with the gift given by one being, be it supreme, to another, although this concept of grace is not absent from the Vedantic perspective on some level of conventional consideration. But in fact, it is rather contemplated, grace is contemplated as being the deepest nature and the deepest influx of reality, of the supreme reality. Thus, it could be said that devotion and grace are like the human and divine elements of the spiritual equation. And in fact, the guru stands at the crossroad of the two, as object of devotion and as subject of grace. This double reality appears in the apparent tension, not to say contradiction, between the non-dual view of the guru and the need to keep contemplating him as guru. In Guru Ramana Vachanamala, we read that, I quote, "The idea of non-duality is fit to be cherished in respect to all things whatsoever, but not with respect to the Guru," end of quote. So there is a plane on which the distinction between the Guru and the disciple or the devotee is fully effective and is indeed the fuel of spiritual motion. On the other hand, however, the reduction of the Guru to the status of a man, while he is actually, quote, unlimited pure consciousness, is deemed in the same text to be the fact of a, I quote, most sinful person with a foul mind. Indeed, confusing the Guru with his human form is nothing but the projection of one's own limitations upon the Guru. It is, I quote, "the reflection of the individuality of those who love individuality, and ultimately an incapacity to grasp that the sage is within himself and that all sages are one and the same," end of quote. This unity in diversity, or diversity in unity, is also manifested in the fact that while the Maharshi relentlessly brought back his devotees to the question, "Who am I?" he excluded, in fact, none of the traditional ways and practices. For him, all spiritual paths, all sadhanas had in common their ability to facilitate a process of concentration on the ultimate reality. Among these methods, one way is often mentioned by the Maharshi as an efficacious means of spiritual realization: Japa Yoga, the path of invocatory prayer. The Maharshi's teachings are rarely associated with japa, since they are primarily expressing the investigative search for the self. It is this very search and its interiorizing modalities that not a few of the Maharshi's visitors found, however, too abstract. This abstraction of the investigation probably pertained in their mind to the absence of formal supports in self-investigation. By contrast, the way of japa may be considered more concrete inasmuch as it rests upon the verbal substance of names and sacred formulas. When presented with this sort of difficulty, the Maharshi would respond in two ways. The first type of response would state that "Who am I?" is actually the best japa. This response was a way perhaps to redirect the attention of the seeker toward the ultimate meaning and function of japa, which is ultimately self-realization, and therefore away from a one-sided conception of the japa as directed toward an external divine reality. The question, "Who am I?" is a japa to the extent that it is a way of remembering the self or focusing on it, which is the function also of chanting and repetition. However, the Maharshi would sometimes also respond to questions about the benefits of japa on more methodical and propedeutic grounds. In such cases, he would recommend japa as a way to keep the mind away from distractions. The fact that the Maharshi could refer to chanting and japa as, quote, best aids suggests that in such cases, japa was conceived by him as an adjuvant rather than as a central practice, which is hardly surprising when one considers the way he prioritized self-investigation. In other words, japa can provide spiritual support to the way of centering that does culminate in self-inquiry. Another way of contemplating the primarily adjuvant character of japa is to take into account the Maharshi's reflections on the ill-fittedness of trying to impose non-dual consciousness upon the workings of daily life. And here I quote the Maharshi, "Advaita should not be practiced in ordinary activities. It is sufficient if there is no differentiation in the mind. If one keeps cartloads of discriminating thoughts within, one should not pretend that all is one on the outside." End of quote. This is an instance of what could be called the Maharshi's spiritual realism. In other words, conventional reality, daily reality, ordinary reality cannot be addressed in terms or in the terms of the infinite. Although the infinite must indeed, the ultimate must indeed provide the background and the essential reference for it. There is perhaps a pseudo Advaita that pretends that things are not different from each other on the level upon which they are indeed quite distinct, and where these differences must be therefore attended to. And such discernment is directly relevant to the respective fields of japa on the one hand and atma vichara on the other hand. In other words, on the one hand, ordinary life presupposes an ability to differentiate. On the other hand, relative existence and daily functionality must be connected to spiritual reality. Whether internal or vocal, japa involves a non-mental spiritual practice that can easily provide the unifying background for one's activities in the world, while not preventing one's practical engagement with differentiations. Now, moving on to the subtle question of the relationship of the Maharshi with the Hindu tradition, which is in a way connected to japa, some have seen the directness and spontaneousness of the Maharshi's spiritual breakthrough as an indication of a kind of disjunction between the spiritual essence of self-realization on the one hand, as a pure spiritual event, so to speak, and on the other hand, the orthodox structures of the Brahmanical tradition. In fact, however, it is, I suggest, sensible to consider that the Maharshi's perspective is best characterized as transcending the formal order in a way that does not imply any specific position or any specific stand with respect to the conservation or modification or removal of any outer structures. In fact, the most constant reoccurring feature of the Maharshi response to questions concerning this level of traditional consideration is or was a relentless return to the fundamental question of the self. As a general tendency, the Maharshi refuses to address, for example, political or social questions on their own level. This is quite illuminating. So, for instance, in reference to the question of the independence of India, the Maharshi interpreted Swaraj by referring to its literal meaning of self-rule. And he considered it as a first step toward self-realization through a kind of gradual enlarging of one's perspective on the meaning of what self means. And always, of course, as conditioned on an utter surrender to the higher rule of the divine self. Similarly, questions of national or ethnic identity were perceived by him as misleading and obstructive in this respect, inasmuch as they rest upon quasi-obsessive limitations upon the self. I quote this dialogue between the Maharshi and one of his visitors. The visitor asked, "Is it not our duty to be patriots?" And the answer of Bhagavan, "It is your duty to be, and not to be this or that. I am that I am sums up the whole of truth." End of quote. Moreover, there is no hint whatsoever in any of the Maharshi's reported teachings to a need to abolish particular structures deemed to be an impediment to self-realization or even to moral and social values and benefits. For the Maharshi, it is plain that the only real effective way to dispense with the structures and abuses of external conditions is through turning inward to the self. Now, on the other hand, on the positive side of karmic engagement, the Maharshi's ways consisted in tracing back the deepest meaning of traditional and social or even political practices. This was achieved by linking every ritual and moral form or action to the self. And it relates to the Maharshi's realistic consideration of the needs and qualifications as they relate to the means of realization. The key to what could be called, I suggest, the dharmic traditionalism of the Maharshi lies in the capacity of external traditional realities to serve as symbols and as supports of meditation in view of self-knowledge. This quote, for example, from the Maharshi is very significant in this respect, in my opinion. He says, observe the disciplines of external conduct, achara, knowing in your heart their real object by properly reflecting on their inner meaning. So the outer becomes the support of the inner, which doesn't mean that the inner abolishes the outer. In fact, quite the contrary in a sense. It founds, it highlights, it unveils the foundations of the outer. Touching the guru's feet with one's hand and bringing the latter to one's eyes is not only an outer sign of reverence, it manifests above all, I quote, one's joining the eye of reflected consciousness to those holy feet, which are the real consciousness. This is another example of the interiorization of the outer. Similarly, a third example, the true meaning of prasad, or sharing the food of the sage, is not only the outer blessing that ensues, but it means, quote, to be blessed with the experience of the self. Therefore, abiding by external norms of traditional or religious behavior must invite one to deepen and refine one's awareness of them as avenues of realization of the self. On the one hand, Dharma culminates in the metaphysical summit of all dharmas, and it is therefore to be revered. I quote, the self-abidance that flourishes when one realizes one's true nature is the supreme dharma of sat achara. On the other hand, the end of dharma transcends all forms so that being is finally substituted to doing. Quote, the aim of all practices is to give up all practices. Given the most intimate identification of Ramana Maharshi with the inquiry, who am I, and the extraordinary diffusion of his presence and teachings throughout the world, one cannot but reflect upon the significance of this question, who am I, for the age, for our age, for the age when it was raised as a kind of synthesis of all spiritual paths. Today, the time of intellectual and spiritual traditions and their intricate and integrated elaborations has waned. There is therefore great urgency in providing synthesis that distills, so to speak, the sap of tradition without having to embrace the profusion of its treasuries and the ambiguities of the totality of its productions, including the most contingent ones. On the other hand, inter-civilizational and inter-religious communications do provide a context that is radically different from anything that had been lived in the past. Thus, the question, who am I, brings back any religious life, in a sense, to its core essentials, while lying at the crossroad of existing religions. This doesn't mean, quite obviously, that most believers would recognize this core as theirs. The Maharshi thought it necessary to make his message available for all those who have ears to hear. most Christians do not readily, for example, reflect upon the most fundamental implications of Christ's admonition, the kingdom of God is within you, nor are most Muslims disposed to delve into the depth of meaning of the verse from the Quran, we, God, are closer to you than your jugular vein. But some do, or some might do, when confronted with the profound insight and transforming presence of the Maharshi's quintessential teachings. The sage's fundamental question is a reminder that the heart of religion, if it is to be a truly and deeply transformative way, lies with the realization or the actualization of a mystery that transcends our individuality while at the same time being its innermost secret. Although most believers would likely shun a direct assertion of divine immanence within the human self, at least in monotheistic Abrahamic traditions, it remains nevertheless true that the experience of divine proximity that is arguably inherent to any interiorized form of religion opens onto an innermost domain of ineffability that cannot but echo intimations of the God within, therefore of the self. In a way, the non-substantial and decentered characters of the illusory individual self that is dispelled by the Maharshi's self-inquiry would seem to make it akin, in some ways, to postmodern deconstructionist projects. Thus, much of the postmodern intellectual bent revolves around the deconstruction of the classical understanding of the self as an individual substance and as a unified field of cognition, volition, and affections. While the classical Western concept of self is characterized by words like substance, permanence, and centering, the postmodern self has been variously referred to as, I quote, for example, Julia Kristeva, zerological, or dispossessed, or else decentered. In the Western philosophical tradition, the self was a substance that undergoes accidents. And this substantial character was or is the basis of permanence in time and of centering in space. It is also a principle of continuous identity and the source of a perspective on reality. This substantial concept of self could be seen as being challenged by the Maharshi's perspective in ways that may find echoes in postmodern thought. Does not the Maharshi, for example, evoke the inexistence of the self as mind when he emphasizes it constantly escaping, the mind constantly escaping one's attempts at reaching or grasping it? So is not the mind around which the self is crystallized constantly deferred, to use a postmodern term? Is not it discontinuous? Isn't it discontinuous and ephemeral as it moves from object to object without any apparent permanence? Finally, is not the self constantly decentered by virtue of its being displaced by its inherent relativeness? Moreover, such categories, such postmodern categories, could also be applied to the self, to the supreme self this time, mutatis mutandis. The supreme self is a kind of void that transcends all determinations. It is self-effulgent, ever renewing itself as aham sphurana, and it is always escaping any relative position, therefore any relative centering. The traditional universe is one in which God is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. This could be applied maybe to the Maharshi's teachings, since the self is center everywhere, and since the periphery, or Maya, has no reality on its own, and therefore no real ontological place, as it were. In the postmodern world, this time by contrast, it could be argued that the center is nowhere and that the periphery is everywhere. The negation of any center is actually one of the possibly most direct ways of defining the postmodern outlook. As for the periphery, it is in a way this différance, R-A-N-C-E, that is the very origin of reality, to quote Derrida. It is like Maya, both inconceivable and necessary, and it is also like a trace of that which is untraceable, the origin without origin. Discussing the postmodern disappearance of the self as the absence of a permanent self, as an absence that is always present, a mere trace, Carl Olsen remarks judiciously that, quote, from Shankara's perspective, it is only possible to discover the absence of a permanent self by means of ignorance. And moreover, it is nonsensical to discuss the disappearance of the self, a self-luminous and timeless reality. Hence, I quote Olsen, according to Shankara, postmodern thinkers write about the self from the perspective of lower knowledge, aparavidya, whereas the Indian philosopher is more concerned with the self from the standpoint of higher knowledge, paravidya, end of quote. And this is the whole difference, and it's a huge one. In other words, the postmodern disappearing self is like the shadow projected by ignorance. That which is not present to itself is not the self. It is a superimposition upon the self. The jiva, inasmuch as it is ignorant of the self, is always deferred, so to speak, in its selfness. But the real self lies above any possible deferment or différance, to use Derrida's term, because it is pure presence to itself. The Maharshi self-realization may also inspire a complementary lesson with respect to the crisis of meaning that has characterized postmodern times. And this is the meaning of the title of the book, Surrendering to the Self. Identity today is at the forefront, the question of identity is at the forefront of many contemporary conflicts and malaise. Groups, individuals are keen to emphasize the rights that they attach to their identity as the very condition of their existence and their development. And there is no doubt that this widespread protestation is both the symptom of a sense of identity in disarray, but also more positively, the distant, sometimes very distant, reflection of the foundational reality of the self as self of all selves. The Maharshi would say that the source of our unhappiness dwells in our inability to situate selfhood where it truly and ultimately belongs. While modern individualism is a symptom of the collapse of most, if not all, forms of organic sense of belonging, the postmodern collapse of the individuals calls for new forms of group belonging that virtually any cultural, ethnic, ideological, or religious symbol can mobilize. From the point of view of self-knowledge, what could be opportunities, therefore, to undo the shackles of some limitation, all too often result, therefore, in the opposite, that is, in the hardening of the boundaries within which the individual or the collective egos bind themselves. Therefore, the idea of surrendering to the self probably sounds like an enigmatic formula to most contemporary ears. First, the term surrender is one that is commonly associated with a sense of alienation. One surrenders to that which overcomes us, to the enemy, for example. And this is already an indication that an external necessity weighs upon us and prevents us from being what we want to be. Accordingly, Surrendering implies that the world of objectivity constrains us in a way that contradicts and alters the virtually unlimited freedom that we claim for ourselves. In such a perspective, surrendering to oneself sounds like an oxymoron. Needless to say, capitalizing the word self can help one realize that what is at stake here is something infinitely greater than our own individuality, since the latter is actually a limitation and in a way a negation of real selfhood, according to the Maharshi. While we are used to consider the other human being, as an interlocutor or an object outside of ourselves, the Maharshi teaches that the other, including the divine other, is in us, that it is us. It is here, no doubt, that devotional religion and spiritual seeking meet. When understood this way, the Buddhist distinction between the power of the self, that the Japanese Buddhist refers to as jiriki, and the power of the other, the divine other, that they refer to as tariki, this distinction becomes a mere question of perspective. Still, it might be argued that the point of view of surrender, akin to tariki, that is to the power of the other, is more specifically adapted to the needs of our times. The way of surrender is intrinsically metaphysical in the sense that it presupposes transcendence, since we surrender to the transcendent. Self-investigation, by contrast, when not properly understood, as also implying transcendence, when it is not understood as implying transcendence, may confine, especially outside of religious and traditional context, to a form of psychological exercise that is far from being guaranteed against the most sterile or dangerous delusions of psychic life. This is no doubt one of the reasons why the Japanese writer Hiroyuki Itsuki has been able to encapsulate what may perhaps appear as a paradox when he writes, Tariki, that is the power of the divine other, is, in my opinion, a more realistic, more mature, and more quintessentially modern philosophy than self-power. And it is a philosophy that can be a great source of strength to live in our world today, end of quote. Many modern readers may disagree with this assessment, which makes it perhaps sound by a twist all the most relevant. The power of the other can sound, quote, unrealistic in the sense that it may conjure up religious images of God that many contemporaries, especially in the West, find unreal or derealizing. But Itsuki's realism is another way to evoke the reality of our finitude, mortality, and wretched limitations. And while turning to the other might sound infantile to some, it is most mature for the one who surrenders. Immaturity, in fact, stems from a lack of awareness of the reality and scope of one's being, a deficit in one's appreciation of what is possible and what is not. While it might be paradoxical to consider as quintessentially modern that which appears to run contrary to the individualistic impulses, and indeed sometimes the Promethean tendencies of modern mankind, a closer examination might reveal that postmodern responses to modernity flow in many ways from coming to terms with the limitations of human knowledge and human endeavors. By quintessentially modern might be meant, therefore, what remains when the modernist illusions of self-power born in the 19th century, scientific progress, and political promises have revealed their cruel boundaries. By contrast, in a way, with Itsuki's assessment of the modern predicament, Archer Osborne, who was a devotee of the Maharshi, considered that the message of the Atma Vichara was a reaffirmation by the Maharshi of the way of knowledge in our times. And he set off this view against the traditional Hindu point of view, which tends to see Japa Yoga as the most fitting spiritual method in the days of the Kali Yuga, the final age of obscuration of spirituality. The 2 points of view, that of Itsuki and that of Osborne, are far from being incompatible, however. While Osborne's opinion points to a need that must be fulfilled in order to compensate for the virtual disappearance of the way of knowledge in the religious field, it also brings out questions on how what is most needed, that is knowledge, is equally less likely to be assimilated by want of qualifications and supporting context. Close disciples of the Maharshi, such as Anamana Swami, for example, have asserted, I quote, that most people have to follow other paths than Atma Vichara until they are ready for the final path. Showing that the path of knowledge and the way of surrender, far from being contrary, are like the two sides of the same reality is, in that sense, the most beneficial task that be. This conjunction is all the more important to stress that self-inquiry on its own has never been as fraught with perils and more problematic an approach in the absence of a religious and ethical culture that would provide it with foundations and help purify its spiritual intentions. While simplicity, synthesis, and essentiality are the order of the day, it must be also acknowledged that the conditions for its bearing fruits have never been so lacking, perhaps, as a whole. As for the Maharshi himself, and I will conclude on this point, his modernity is just another name, perhaps, for his perennity. He is in all that was, quoting here Professor Mahadevan, he is in all that was, that is, and will be. He is the ancient and yet the only modern, end of quote. If presence is the state of being present, then there is no doubt that the Maharshi is indeed a sage for the present, since his has been above all an action of presence, and to the extent that he has always emphasized the most essential nature of the self as ever present. Granted, this action of presence was most vividly documented during his terrestrial life, and the various testimonies that have been included, for example, in my book and in many other books, bear witness to it. But it knows no place and no time, being that of the self. As the Maharshi stressed it in many occurrences, the real Sadguru, the real Guru of being, is the self, which amounts to saying that the question, who am I, is the essence of all paths. Hence, and that is my conclusion, the Maharshi's message is a reminder of what is both the core essence and the goal, the ultimate goal of all spiritual ways, is irrespective of traditional and religious differences. And it is as such, as core and as goal, that it does enlighten their means, their diverse means, their diverse spiritual and religious means, while at the same time deepening their reach. I thank you very much for your attention, and I will be most happy to answer any question or enter in dialogue with you.
Thank you, Patrick, for your enriching presentation. And now, dear friends, let us join in. And today we would be concluding by around 6:30 or so. We might take a grace time of 5-10 minutes. So to begin with, I invite Gyan Luigi, please.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. I'm audible.
Yes.
I'm audible.
Yes,
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. It was really very interesting. And I noticed some points. Well, as regards, I would say, as regards the question of the, this is perhaps a question which is more relevant for the discussion now of the fundamentals of the ontology in Europe, Western Europe, and anyway in the traditional Western philosophy. As regards the question of the substance, which is of course a fundamental one, a central one, the centrality or the refusal of the category of substance as the principal category of ontology and of metaphysics, I would say that the perspective of postmodernism is, of course, very interesting, but I would say that we have something anticipating it in a certain sense, because if we, for instance, take into consideration the works of Nicolaus of Hues, he had anticipated in a certain sense that the substance cannot be the right category in order to interpret, consider, and understand the absolute, the goodness, the deity, God himself. And he had elaborated, so to speak, an alternative way of God, of deity, and of the foundation of reality as the coincidence of the opposites. Where the center is not the God is not the center, there is anyway an opposition, interesting opposition to the our conception of substance in Nicolaus, and this opposition, I would say, in a certain sense, if I rightly understand, anticipates some position of the postmodernist interpretation of ontology as an ontology which does not found its foundations on the substance. This is an interesting point, I would say. And as regards the question of today, I would say that, well, I find very interesting the point of the being deferred of Jiva. And I would say that I find some difficulties in Mahana interpretation of self-inquiry. But I would say that as far as I understand him, that what I normally would interpret as an expansion of the awareness, that is, I am this or that, is in his thought, so to speak, reversed. Because if I say I am this or that, for him, as I understand him, provided I correctly understand this thought, if I am this or that, or so a series of adjectives, of attributes, of properties, actually make my I far from the I. That is, what I think would be awareness of reality. That is, I am this. That is, I am aware that I am this or that. In truth, is for him turns out to be something which makes me far from my I, because if I say I am this or that, independently of what these that are, I am transposed to a dimension which is no longer that of the I. And therefore, it is so important for him to say, no, be not that or that, be not patriot, be, because to complete the sense of being with an attribute, independently of the attribute of the property, is something which destroys my awareness of my I. That is, I am transposed to the being differentiated, to the being deferred of the jiva, whereas I am thinking that I am acting as an aware and making performing an act of awareness. I would say that I am not sure that I have correctly understood his thought, but I think that he is, so to speak, reverting the concept of the performing of the awareness. That is, I usually would say I am this or that. That is, I am aware of this or that. And he say, no, if you do this, you are aware of this or that, but this means that you are no longer aware of the I, of the self. So this is a question. I am not sure that I have correctly understood, because the question of the self-inquiry, I have found this question, this problem in this thought as really very complex, and I would say I need time in order to correctly interpret this part of his thought. Thank you very much anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, Gian Luigi.
Thank you.
So now, Patrick, we request your
Yes.
thought after one or two submissions. Okay,
Yes, I would like to.
any other friend? Okay, in the meantime, Minati. Minati.
Hello. Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Am I audible? Hello.
Yes, you are audible, please. Yes.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. First, I would like to thank Professor Patrick Laude for his beautiful and enriching presentation. So it is a very different topic than the regular ones. So I have some few things to share. Do I have time? 2-3 minutes, can I speak? Hello. Yeah. So among the philosophy of the Ramana Maharshi, there are many things actually about, when you do self-studying. So that is, the first thing is from that Akram Mukti to Karma Mukti, which is like from sudden liberation to gradual liberation. So then the second thing is, there are what is the striking thing about what he thought about Gyan. Like, there is nobody is Gyani and nobody is a Gyani. Like, nobody is a liberated being and nobody is a non-liberated being. What makes a person an individual is self-aware, is the Gyan. So that is the one point we can take from his teachings. Then another process, like there he had three things, like truth, from truth to consciousness, and from consciousness to bliss. So truth is about what I thought, and consciousness is about our true nature, and the bliss is that simply being free from all the thought. So these are the, actually he wrote about that poetry we did not discuss, that the first thing he wrote, Akshara Manmala, about that devotional poetry. It was a magnum opus to the devotion to Lord Shiva, to Shankara. Among all these things, he did whatever all these yogis or the teachers or the gurus were doing, but he never believed in reincarnation. So there is no reincarnation. Reincarnation is a part of Hindu philosophy and Hindu mythology, whatever we say it. So for that brutal one follower, actually he had said that one of the last India's spiritual supermen for him. So I quote from his writings. And it's like, I like him greatly because he's so simple and modest. When an atmosphere of authentic greatness lies so palpably around him, because he makes no claims to occult powers or the hierophanetic knowledge to impress the mystery loving nature to his countrymen. And because he's so totally without any traces of pretension that it strongly resists every efforts to canonize him during his lifetime, unquote. From these things, I have one query about, how do we know our true identity? So if this question can be answered, and thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Minati. You have also done your not only homework but your hard work. So thank you. Now, yes, maybe
Ananta,
Patrick, you would like? Yes, please. Yes. You would
am
like?
I to answer now, or should I wait for more questions?
Maybe one
Maybe.
more, if it is one
Yes,
more.
yes. Yes.
So now, Randhir, please.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you, Professor Patrick, for giving a thought-provoking talk, and it really helped us to understand Bhagwan Ram Maharshi and his unconventional spirituality and consciousness, immortality. Because when we understand the path of liberation, it has become again contested thing, and some thinker, like I can relate Ramana Maharshi with Krishnamurti for that matter. Something which cannot be understood and which cannot be explained. It can only be realized. So in that spirit, I think, and that is the method. Of course that is not a method, and that cannot be even method. But I think that category of methodology, I think we can use in order to understand such unconventional spirituality for that matter, and particularly the question of I, which is which cannot be understood psychologically. It can only be understood philosophically and beyond the philosophical. In that sense, I think we have to develop some new epistemology of understanding self and spirituality for that matter, because the whole question of existence, awareness, and peace, so there must be a kind of new epistemology we have to understand all these unconventional philosophers. Of course, you use a very excellent way of Derrida's, but I think is much more deeper than the whole question of cosmology. Thank you so much, sir, for giving us such thoughtful session.
Thank you very much to all of you, and thank you for the questions. I will do my best to try to address some of them at least. I took some notes, but if I forget something, please remind me. These are very interesting and difficult questions. The question of the epistemology, Dr. Randhir, what you mentioned last, from the point of view of Ramana Maharshi, from the point of view of his teachings, at least such as we have them, there is only one epistemology in a certain sense, and there cannot be any other that would take the first one as an object of study, if I may put it that way. For him, episteme, knowledge has to do with, as I repeated several times, with the self-knowledge, or the knowledge that the self has of itself. And as soon as this self is objectified, for example, as an object of study, one can be sure it's not the self anymore. So there is a sort of impossibility to deal with the self in the sense in which the Maharshi understands it as the object of an epistemology, paradoxically perhaps. Now, in terms of reincarnation, I'm taking things in disorder. The question of reincarnation was discussed, and transmigration and so forth. I'm not sure the Maharshi opposes or denies the reality of transmigration in general sense. What I think he's doing simply is that every time he's asked a question about a post-mortem state, a posthumous state, what happens after my physical death, right? He refuses to answer in these terms. And he always says, well, you are so interested in knowing what happens next, but tell me, who are you now? You have to start with the first priorities, not what happens to me next, but what am I now? And then the question of what happens next might result from it, but you have to take the first questions first. So he moves constantly from eschatology, when he's asked such question, moves away from eschatology to Advaitin epistemology, if you want to put it that way. Because for him, eschatological questions, whether transmigration or others, are a kind of distraction from the only question that matters, which is, who am I? So anything that takes one away from it is a distraction. Then there is the question of truth, consciousness, and bliss. Of course, the Maharshi, as you know, I'm sure, did not study Vedanta or Advaita or Shankara or Sureshwara or others in his youth. He had no traditional culture. And not only that, but he even told that he had no idea when he was a young man, before his self-realization, he had no idea he didn't know what a sadhana is. He didn't know what a spiritual path is. And so in that respect, his case is extraordinary. It's the example of somebody who has a sort of spontaneous self-realization independently from any apparent, at least, preparation. And so everything he said and taught and even wrote about it later on was dependent upon information that he gained after his self-realization. So in a sense, he was able in different ways, in order to answer questions, to formulate or to reformulate aspects of his own experience and his own teaching in terms that he had borrowed and learned from other sources. The Aksharamala was mentioned earlier, the poetry, the hymns in praise of Shiva, which is praise of Arunachala Shiva. And so that too was extraordinary, because here again, it's not, one doesn't start from an a priori knowledge, let's say, of Sanskrit or any other Indian language or poetical meter or anything. It's something that basically was inspired, in response to the particular needs of devotees who wanted to have some kind of chanting in honor of Arunachala. He one day had this inspiration of this poetry coming to him. So we have here the example of somebody who was totally independent from any a priori intellectual or even traditional upbringing. And that's what makes, in a sense, his case extraordinarily interesting and appealing, and that gives it the freshness that he has. That is that everything that he learns and that he uses in order to respond to questions, for example, he does so from a perspective that enlightens, so to speak, the meanings of this traditional data in a way that is very fresh and very direct, and non-academic in a negative sense of the term. Now, the question of coincidence of opposites, it's very interesting. Yes, it's not the substance. because of course, it all depends how one understands the term substance. I mean, in the Western tradition, yes, the substance is that which stands below, and it is that which gives unity to this substance, to this unit of reality, but we call the substance. And which at the same time in a way limits it, because there are substances, and even if you understand God as a supreme substance in the Spinozian sense, then it's different perhaps because you have this infinite substance and so forth. But the notion of the notion of substance could very well be applied to the self in the way the Maharshi understands it, if it is given a different meaning. If by substance is simply meant that which is the underlying reality of all, then why not call the self the substance with a capital L? Of course, the meaning would be different from the one that it has accrued in the Western philosophical tradition. But if what is meant by that, the reality that underlies all reality, well, why not? That's a substance. And it is at the same time a coincidence of opposites too, in the sense that it is that which is the principle of unity of the whole, and therefore in it, with it, by it, everything is in a state of coincidence in a certain sense. Everything coincides in it, with it, by it. Everything is present, given, accessible in the self, by the self, and is the self. And in the self, there's no opposites, but there is a coincidence, certainly, and the opposites lose their oppositeness, so to speak. And all dualities are transcended. So that's a possible way of approaching the topic of the substance. I'm missing there was another question that I'm missing now. Could you please remind me if I forget some questions?
Yeah. Hello. Yeah. Someone
Yes,
had asked what is the difference between Maya and practical life? If I'm not wrong,
yes,
somebody had
Maya
asked.
and practical life. Yes, Maya and practical. No, I mentioned Maya because it's a very interesting question and point that the Maharshi is making, because very often in mystical discourse you find the idea that there is only one reality, let's say, and therefore, and of course, mysticism is emphasizing, the idea, for example, of samadhi, let's say, or ecstasy in the Christian tradition and so forth. Therefore, an experience of unity. But what does it mean concretely in terms of daily existence? How is it possible? That's a question that the Maharshi answers is, how is it possible to deal with diversity? Because our daily life is diversity by definition. We go from one thing to the next, from one business to another, one conversation to another, and so on and so forth, one activity to another. So we deal with daily life is diversity, or is multiplicity. So how can it be integrated within the sense of non-duality? And so the Maharshi is saying, don't confuse the two. There is the domain of action, so to speak, of daily action, of daily engagement, and there is the domain of non-duality. Of course, when you say that, you seem to imply that there are two domains. Therefore, it seems to be contrary to non-duality. If there is a domain of daily action and then domain of non-duality, it's not non-duality anymore. But I think what he means simply is that when you address daily reality, you address it in its own terms, simply. You don't meditate upon non-duality when you are attending to your cooking. You just cook. You just do your cooking, and by virtue of doing your cooking, in a sense, you realize non-duality by the presence that you bring to your cooking. Take this example. So I think what he was kind of hinting at was that one must not confuse the levels of involvement, so to speak. There's a spiritual, intellectual, in the highest sense of intellectual non-dual awareness or consciousness rather, on the one hand, but on the other hand, when the awareness, which is in a way the reflection of consciousness, is engaged in activity, daily activity, then it has to attend to diversity in its own terms. Otherwise, it would be a kind of pseudo-mysticism whereby you would be unable to attend to diversity. If you were in a kind of state of inability to differentiate, you could not even put one foot in front of another in the morning, right? Or you would trip immediately. So, what is very interesting on a very concrete manner is that the testimonies we have of the Maharshi, and in that sense, I don't think he's exceptional in that respect. There are testimonies about great sages that ring the same kind of bell, but the Maharshi was apparently an extremely attentive person, extremely scrupulous and extremely effective also in his daily activities. He would supervise the work of in the kitchen of the ashram, for example, with great rigor and great effectiveness, you know. So he was the opposite of a dreamer. If you think in the Western world, sometimes when you say that he's a mystic, you mean he's a kind of dreamer, you know. He's not present. But that's exactly the opposite. So this is non-duality in action, so to speak. Yeah. So Maya in that sense is refers to the domain of daily reality, which has to be addressed in its own terms. So you may know that Maya is Maya, but that doesn't mean that you cannot engage with it on a daily basis.
So thank you, Patrick and friends. Maybe slowly we would be, on the way to bring our hands and hearts together. So
Yes.
Randhir, you can kindly take it forward. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you. Now I would like to invite Ms. Miniti Pradhanji to offer vote of thanks.
Okay. I am Minati Pradhan from the behalf of Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming and its collaboration with Raffles University. Thank all the participants, in fact. And I thank our esteemed chief speaker, Professor Patrick Laude, for his very insightful and deep presentation, which enlightened us so many aspects of Ramana Maharshi's philosophy. I also thank our moderator, Professor Kumar Giri, for arranging the topic and giving us the opportunity to learn through these excellent webinars. I also thank all the participants on the Facebook platform or the Zoom platform. I thank Professor Gan Luigi for being a consistent participant and his views and opinions for all the webinars. I thank Dr. J.C. Jayradha for her enlightening question, and Professor Patrick Laude once again for giving each detailed answers to all the queries and questions and keeping his opinion on all the discussed subject. And that the last, not the least, I thank our convener, Professor Randhir Kumar Gautam, for arranging all these things, very meticulously, and I forgive me if I'm forgetting somebody's name. I thank everyone and thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you and Happy New Year to everyone.
Okay, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Lovely.